Hello friends and welcome back to the beginning of a brand new reading vlog. Today is the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people, which means it's the beginning of the Read Palestine Challenge. It's the 29th of November when I'm filming this, and starting from today we are being encouraged to read books by Palestinian authors and about Palestine for the next week. And so that's what we're going to be doing together in this video. Obviously, if you missed out on this collective readathon and you're watching this after the fact, any day is a good day to read a book by a Palestinian author. I thought I would quickly show you a whole bunch of books just to give you an idea of some of the books that you might be interested in reading, and then we can have a bit of a chat about the books that I want to prioritize trying to get to this week. Let's start with fiction, then we'll talk about non-fiction, and then some poetry and short stories. Firstly, I have a book written by Susan Abulhawa. She's written a bunch of books, but the one that I have is Against the Loveless World. Then we have A Woman Is No Man by Itaf Ram, which is actually my Blossom Book Club's book for the month of December. Then a book that I bought because it is listed on my friend Sonia Solomon's website, where she's recommended a whole bunch of Palestinian speculative fiction. I'll leave a link to that website down below. That is an incredible resource that Sonia's put together that I cannot recommend enough, especially if you're looking for speculative fiction and or short stories. Short stories aren't always my thing, but a novel that caught my eye on that list a couple of months ago is Wondrous Journeys in Strange Lands by Sonia Nimna. The next one is a book that I picked up from my local bookshop a couple of years ago while I was just browsing. It's Haifa Fragments by Khulud Khamis. Then a book that you might have heard of recently is Minor Detail by Adania Shibli. Then another book that I know is often recommended on these kinds of lists is Salt Houses by Hala Alyan. And I think it was Sim Kern who compared this book to Pachinko, intergenerational family saga sort of situation. Now I have two collections of short stories. The first is Palestine plus 100, stories from a century after the Nakba. This is another book that was recommended to me by my friend Sonia. It's a collection of speculative short fiction, and one of my favorite short stories I've ever read is in this one. Highly recommend. Then a book that's pretty chunky is Speak Bird, Speak Again, Palestinian Arab Folktales. And this is a collection, and honestly it's pretty academic. There's a lot of footnotes and translation notes, so if that's your thing, this might be of interest. For poetry, I recently read Rifka by Mohammed El Kurd, which I loved. And then I've also read one collection by Mahmoud Darwish, which I loved. This is Mural. And then I also have one more by him, I Don't Want This Poem to End. Now for some non-fiction, of course, I've got some Raja Shahade. One of my favorite books of all time is Palestinian Walks. And the follow-up to that book is Going Home. Then I know a book that a lot of people have been picking up lately because it's been out of stock everywhere is The 100 Years' War on Palestine, A History of Settler Colonial Conquest and Resistance by Rashid Khalidi. A book I've spoken about an awful lot over the years, again originally recommended to me by Sonia, is This Is Not a Border, Reportage and Reflection from the Palestine Festival of Literature. Then two more that I have not read is Palestine Speaks, Narratives of Life Under Occupation, and The Last Earth, A Palestinian Story. So those are the Palestinian books that I currently have on my shelves, some of which I've read and highly recommend, some of which I have yet to get to. But I've got a little pile here of books that I would like to prioritize this week. I've got one non-fiction, two fiction, and then a poetry. So the poetry is I Don't Want This Poem to End by Mahmoud Darwish. As I mentioned, I read Mural, was it last year? And I just loved it. So not long after that, I picked up a second collection of his. And I think these were poems that were published after he passed away in 2008. Then a book that I've been wanting to get to for quite a while is Against the Loveless World. It was kind of a toss-up between this and Salt Houses. I've heard incredible things about both, but there is an audiobook available for this one. And especially when we're trying to get through a handful of books in 1 week, I think having an audiobook would be good. The other novel that I want to get to, and actually we're going to start with this one. I don't have an audiobook for this one, but I'm still keen. It's Wondrous Journeys in Strange Lands. Then for non-fiction, I think I would like to finally read Going Home. As I mentioned, Palestinian Walks by this author is one of my favorite non-fiction books that I've ever read. And this is the kind of follow-up to that one. So these are the 4 books that I'm going to aim to finish in just 1 week. Obviously, as you've seen, I have plenty of other options to keep me busy if I manage to get through all of these. But as I said, we will be starting with Wondrous Journeys in Strange Lands, and I'm keen to get stuck in. So let's get reading. Hello friends, welcome to Thursday. Today has been a pretty chill day for me. I had my hydro session this morning, and then in between reading I've just been doing a bit of house cleaning. So I am about halfway through the book. I'm up to part 3, which is page like 115-ish, and I think there's about 250 pages, so almost halfway. This book, honestly, it's not what I don't know what I was expecting, but whatever I was expecting, it wasn't this. I think from memory when I picked this up, the main kind of takeaway I had from the synopsis was that it was speculative fiction and it was centered around a small town in Palestine that had some kind of curse on it, where basically when babies were born, they were all boys. There were no girls being born anymore. Basically, I was intrigued. And while the little village with a curse is definitely part of the plot, at least so far, it was a very small part of the story. It's about a woman whose father was originally from this village, this cursed village. And so while we are introduced to her and we do spend a little bit of time in this village, this woman basically decides that she is going to spend her whole life traveling. And so it is very fast paced and we don't really spend a lot of time in any one place or with any like one group of people. We're just following this woman as she moves from place to place and she spends time with different people, learning different things. It's just one big life adventure. But you know, she's riding on camelback, crossing the desert, trying to get to Egypt, and then she gets captured and gets sold off as a slave, and the person she ends up being sold to turns out to be the princess. And because our main character is quite the storyteller, the princess, you know, takes a liking to her. Then through a series of events, she decides that she wants to travel on the seas. In order to do so, she has to pretend that she's a man, so she dresses like a man, and the ship that she ends up working on turns out to be a pirate ship. It really is just this kind of whirlwind adventure of this woman's life. And so I'm starting to think that maybe my perception of what I was getting into with this book is just I was wrong. I was wrong. And the last part of the blurb does say that this richly imagined historical fable recalls the famous travel narratives of the 14th century Moroccan traveller, Ibn Battuta. I'm probably saying that incorrectly. So historical fable. Historical fable definitely sums up the feeling of this much more than whatever I had in my head. And it's honestly very unlike what I usually read. It doesn't really feel like there's, you know, some kind of overarching plot. It doesn't necessarily feel like there's any particular direction that we're heading in. Honestly, it just feels like a wild, fun ride. And it's funny in a way because even though what has gone on in her life so far is absolutely wild, we spend about as much time on the wild moments as we do the kind of transition moments. And so everything almost feels as if it's kind of the same level. I don't know if that makes any sense. So even though, you know, being sold as a slave sounds like it could be quite traumatic, and I'm sure it was, the way that it's told is just very matter of fact. We don't linger on it. It just kind of happens and then we're on to the next thing. And so while I'm interested and I'm just intrigued by this woman and her strange life, I think if this had have been some like epic fantasy adventure novel, it would have been a hell of a lot more stressful to read. And instead, this is just kind of quite quaint and cozy in a way. At least for now. I still have half the book to go. And yeah, I am enjoying it. I'm just realizing how bad this shadow is when I'm waving the book in front of me. But anyway, that's your update. My goals for this evening are hopefully to finish reading this book. It's a little ambitious, but I feel like I can do it. But I'm rambling. And if I want to finish this book, I have a lot of reading to do tonight. Welcome to Friday morning. I am very happy to tell you that last night I did indeed manage to finish Wondrous Journeys in Strange Lands. Now, I don't really want to talk too much more about the plot because I feel like I already gave you a couple of spoilers along the way, but I don't really feel like they spoil the story because the story really is just like one event after another, after another, after another. And even though the story is interesting, it's kind of sort of not really the point. I really enjoyed my time with this book. It was quite unlike anything I've really read, especially lately. Like I said, we don't really linger in any particular moment or place. Our main character is moving from country to country every couple of years and it all happens really quite quickly. She's in Palestine, she's in Egypt, she's in some little island off Spain, she's in India, and everywhere in between. And everywhere she goes, she ends up meeting really interesting people and having adventures. And she's clearly just like an exceptional kind of woman, an exceptional character. You know, she's basically a doctor, she's basically a healer, she's an incredible storyteller, and everywhere she goes, people fall in love with her. I think essentially it's a story about curiosity, generosity, kindness, and love. Love for people and love for life. Our main character, being a woman, is underestimated almost everywhere that she goes. And in fact, like I mentioned yesterday, sometimes she even has to pretend to be a man just to get to where she's going. And while she and her life are very interesting and they are fun to read about, I think ultimately it's kind of just about how life itself is the greatest adventure. So I really liked it. I liked it a lot. And in fact, I feel like this is almost something that I'm gonna look back on with almost more fondness than I had while reading it. There's just something about the feeling this leaves you with that I think I'm gonna hold close. So I finished that around 10 o'clock last night. So I did decide to get started on our next book, which is gonna be Going Home. This is a book I have been really, really looking forward to. And I'm just a few chapters in and I'm already in love. I love Raja. I love how reflective he is. And I love how we get to witness bits of history alongside his personal experiences. But that introspection and that reflection is held really tenderly within the context of Palestine and the history and the occupation. But anyway, that is where we're at for now. I'm going to get stuck into the rest of Going Home, and I reckon we'll have it finished by this afternoon. So we're back on Friday evening, and I have finished Going Home by the one and only Raja Shahade. I know I'm not always great at picking which books I'm going to love, but I pretty much knew like years ago that I was going to adore this book. I just loved Palestinian Walks so thoroughly that he would have had to do something very left of field for me not to adore this book too. I think of the two, Palestinian Walks will always be my favorite, partly because it was my first introduction, partly because I got to read it with my book club and that chat was great. But also the fact that that book is written about 7 walks over the period of about 30 years, whereas this book is about one walk, the walk that he took on the 50th anniversary of the occupation. That being of 1967, so this was in 2017. But the way that this was written and the way that it was conveyed was very similar to the way that Palestinian Walks was structured, in the sense that the walk is kind of the basis point, and then while he's on the walk and while he's reflecting on what he's seeing and what he's noticing, he's then also reflecting on his own personal history, the history of Palestine more generally. He's thinking about his family, he's thinking about things that he's witnessed, he's just thinking, and we're privy to all of those thoughts. And a big theme that is in this book that wasn't so much in Palestinian Walks is that of aging, and I suppose Raja essentially reckoning with his own legacy, both personally and politically. As an older man walking through the city that he's lived in for so many years and basically like taking in all of the changes that he has been witness to, he's reflecting on his own role in the Palestinian resistance. I know I've spoken about Palestinian Walks so much, but just in case you haven't heard me say it, Raja is a lawyer. And so a lot of his work in terms of Palestinian resistance revolved around representing his people in Israeli courts, fighting for their freedom when they've been arrested, or fighting for their homes when they were being taken over. And so while these weren't necessarily always successful in and of themselves, essentially his like kind of secondary function was to document the crimes of Israel. But obviously the occupation has not ended. And I mean, he reflects on it having gotten worse by 2017 when he was writing this book. And obviously in this moment we're in now, things have just escalated in a whole new way. And so I'm going to use the word reflecting a lot, but while he's reflecting on his experience and what he was hoping to achieve and what he was hoping to do, he's realizing now in his old age that essentially he, along with the Palestinian resistance up until this point, have essentially, in many ways, failed. Now, those are his words, not mine. So in some ways, he does give a little bit of a old man shouts at cloud kind of vibe, but equally there is this huge sense of humility and just witnessing kind of quite honestly both the achievements and the successes, but also the limitations and perhaps the failures. And so while he is, as an older man, kind of not really understanding the young people around him in a lot of ways, he's also coming to accept the fact that he has done about as much as he can, and essentially it's time to pass the torch. And I just want to read you some of the very many. As you can see, I've like dog-eared. I've underlined so much of this book. I just want to read you a couple of those lines. For many years, I raged in anger at my fate. Now, when I look back over my life, I can see that the occupation has provided me with an immense amount of work and great challenges, not only in how to resist, but in how to live under its ruthless matrix of control as a free man refusing to be denied the joys of life. After 50 years of trying, we have not succeeded in forcing Israel to end its occupation of our land. This would have required a stronger, more sustained struggle and much greater sacrifices. All we could do was to bring Israel to self-destruct. The country that occupied us half a century ago bears little resemblance to the Israel of today. By forcing them to justify the unjustifiable, that which is patently illegal, we have helped them destroy their legal system, and through their open discrimination, the rule of law and respect for international law. We have certainly not won, but neither have they. So it was quite a melancholy, somber kind of read, but also one in which Raja adamantly refuses to be hopeless. I think it's a really beautiful, poignant portrayal of aging and of Palestine, particularly Ramallah. And I just thought the way that he intertwined all of that with a reflection and a reckoning with his own legacy was just kind of beautiful and heartbreaking, and I loved it. Do I need to say more? I absolutely loved it. Anyway, with that out of the way, tonight I am actually signed up for a Zoom call. I mean, I'm not going to be on the Zoom call, I'm just listening in. It's basically a conference and it's called How to Talk About Gaza Right Now. And the description is how to speak about Gaza in this moment and beyond. What does a humanitarian pause mean? And what is our way forward? Bring your questions and join us in this safe learning environment. So if we can figure it out, Blair and I are going to watch this together on the TV. It feels quite poignant because it was just a few hours ago that the humanitarian pause ended. So it feels quite timely. I'm really looking forward to this chat tonight. And if I'm able to record, I will share some clips with you. But in the meantime, I am going to get started on some poetry, and I will see you tomorrow.
First of all, the one thing that I agree we need to analyse is the language that is used, because it has very much plugged into the pattern of dehumanising language that the media deploys whenever Palestinians are spoken about in the media and discussed. And I remember in the very beginning, there was a headline referring to Palestinian females and teenagers and Israeli women and children.
If they only knew, right? If they only could see, then surely they wouldn't let that happen. And the fact that they're seeing and they're letting it happen could be only explained by anti-Palestinian racism. We are completely, especially, this is historical, but especially after 7th of October, completely been taken out of the category of the human.
When they say it's the war on Hamas, but all you're seeing on your newsfeed is babies and families and houses and infrastructure and hospitals being at the receiving end of the bombs. And so the name of the way that it's presented as a war on Hamas, when it's actually the ethnic cleansing of Gaza and a war on the Palestinian people, all of them in Gaza, without distinction.
The elephant in the room is not necessarily Hamas. It's the question of, do Palestinians have the right to resist? Because it's the question of armed resistance in the face of multiple examples in which non-violent resistance has been met with violence by Israel, such as the Great March of Return, or the BDS movement is criminalized, or we are shadow banned when we are on social media, or our poets and politicians and artists and activists are assassinated. So if you want to have a serious conversation in the West about Hamas, what is the alternative that you have allowed Palestinians? Because if you're not willing to have a conversation about resistance, then what you are ultimately saying is that Palestinians must acquiesce to their oppression.
That Hamas being the security excuse, Israel has a right to defend itself excuse right now, but Hamas came 22 years after Israeli occupation of Gaza began, and decades after 1948. And Israel has always found a reason why it needed to oppress the Palestinians, to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians, to throw Palestinians in jail for security purposes. So before Hamas, after Hamas, it is Israel that is the issue here. And that is what we need to talk about, rather than waste our time talking about a Palestinian faction. And by the way, not all Palestinians support Hamas. It's a political faction, just like there's diversity in every political spectrum. And not all Palestinians support its method of resistance. But that should not be the point. It is beside the point. The point is, does Israel have a right to do what it's doing? And that's where I like to keep my focus.
Hello, it is Saturday evening and I have been out for quite a lot of the day. I headed into the city earlier this morning to meet my friend Rosie. We went to a couple of bookshops, although I didn't buy any. Am I okay? We had lunch, we got to catch up and chat. It was lovely. Also, I did try to screen record the Zoom chat that I was talking to you about last night. It was an amazing chat and they spoke about a whole host of things, but particularly about like the kind of language that we're seeing being used in the media, but also the language that we can and should be using when we're talking about Palestine. Now, I know when I used to talk about Palestine online, I would often start with a disclaimer of, the fact that being critical of Zionism is not anti-Semitism. I understand that anti-Semitism is real and it's dangerous and I don't want to engage in that. I'm being very intentional and careful about my language. I'm very specifically criticizing a government and their policies and the way that they're treating the Palestinians. And while all of that is true, I still am very careful because I really don't want to be engaging with anti-Semitism. Equally, in the last couple of years, and I think especially this year, I have moved away from adding a disclaimer to every single time I try and talk about Palestine, because I think it kind of reinforces the idea that talking about Zionism and criticizing Zionism does have to be tangled up with anti-Semitism, and I just don't think that's true. And I think we do a great disservice to the Palestinian cause when we spend most of our time talking about how we're not being anti-Semitic by talking about Palestine, rather than just talking about Palestine and what it is that we want for Palestine and why we support Palestine. They also spoke about the collective action that's been going on around the world in the last 2 months. And Samar in particular spoke about how dangerous fatigue is and how that is the thing that we need to be so careful of giving into. She spoke about how we need to make space for all of the grief and the anger and the sadness and the horror, while also finding ways to embrace joy and love and connection and compassion and all of those things too. We need to hold on to those just as firmly so that we don't burn out, so that we can keep showing up. Anyway, those were some of the topics that they discussed. It was an incredible hour and a half conversation. Anyway, since then, I have actually started and finished Mahmoud Darwish's I Don't Want This Poem to End. I honestly wasn't expecting to be able to get through this whole thing because it's quite long, especially for a poetry collection. It's almost 250 pages. And I'm gonna be honest, this poetry didn't work for me. It went over my head. I don't know if it was translation or just me not understanding, which honestly I was surprised by, because as I mentioned, Mural, Mahmoud's other collection that I have read, I absolutely loved this. Having said that, I am still very glad I read this, because although there is a lot of poetry in here, there is also a very long introduction. Well, there's kind of two introductions. There's an introduction about kind of compiling these poems, because this collection was put together from unpublished works after Mahmoud's death. And then there's another essay by the translator Mohammed Shaheen. And if that wasn't enough, at the end of the book we get like another 30 pages of more content. We get an interview with Mahmoud. We get a letter that he wrote to his brother while he was imprisoned. And then we also get, I guess, an essay from Mahmoud on exile. And all of that content around the poetry, I really enjoyed. So I am glad to have read another collection by Mahmoud Darwish. I know he is just such an incredible and important Palestinian poet. And I'm also happy that we have finished 3 books now, 3 Palestinian books this week. Next on the agenda is Against the Loveless World, which I'm a little bit nervous about, not least of all because it is definitely the longest book that we're reading. It's almost 400 pages, but also I've heard it's pretty heavy. From memory, it's about a Palestinian woman who is a political prisoner in Israel, and she's telling us her story from solitary confinement. I think that's what it's about, but I will let you know tomorrow once I get stuck into it. For now though, I think it is time for bed, because obviously tomorrow is Sunday, which means we've got the weekly march. 12 p.m. every Sunday at the State Library. Melbourne has been marching. Now I did miss last week's march, so it's pretty important for me to get there tomorrow. So I'm gonna head to bed, make sure I'm well rested, and I will see you tomorrow.
Free Palestine! No person with any humanity in them can hear the stories of our Palestinian brothers and sisters in Australia and what's happening to their families. No one can listen to those stories without being deeply moved, as I've been today. When I think about the brutality of what has been unleashed in Gaza, some of the most sophisticated weaponry in the world, provided by their allies, the United States of dystopia. When one considers that sort of brutality, it's clear that the Israeli government seems to think that you can suppress a people's movement through might and force. That is a fallacy. The Palestinian resistance will only go stronger as a result of what's being done now. One doesn't have to be a clairvoyant to predict that. It logically follows. You can't conduct an exercise in horror, as is happening right now, without there being consequences further down the track. What is a young Palestinian person in the midst of all this chaos? What are they supposed to think? What are they supposed to feel? I know how many of our brothers and sisters feel, because as I've said to you here before, we have experienced occupation, invasion, apartheid. We've experienced all of that. We know what it feels like. And that's why it makes one feel so angry at one's helplessness that all we can offer today is words. But believe me, words are mightier than any military might that Israel might be deploying now. I see in the huge crowds that are starting to appear around the world in support of the Palestinian people, I see for the first time in my lifetime a little bit of a break in the armour that the Israelis have had of being able to be in control of the misinformation. I think the people of the world are starting to realise the true nature of the current Israeli regime, which I assure you will not in the long term last. Thank you. Uncle Gary, free Palestine! Free Palestine! Free Palestine!
Good morning, friends. We're in the kitchen. I'm making myself a cup of tea and I have my new watermelon shirt on today. I just realized wearing a white shirt in our white kitchen, I look like a floating head. I will be hopefully finishing Against the Loveless World. I mean, I do have quite a lot to go. I'm up to part 3, so I've just read over 100 pages. And so far this book is harrowing. So what I said earlier about our main character being a political prisoner, that is true. She is telling us her story from her prison cell. And in her story, we first meet her when she's kind of like 17, 18, I think. And pretty quickly she falls in, I would say, infatuation with a young man, and their families arrange for them to marry. But it doesn't go very well and things end up falling apart quite quickly, which leave our main character in this kind of very precarious social position, I suppose. And so she ends up kind of accidentally getting into sex work. It's really not nice how it happens. It wasn't an intentional choice on her part. But then when she realizes how much money is to be made in that work, she sees it as this opportunity to support her family who are not well off, and hopefully to make enough money to allow her brother to travel overseas to study. So that's our main character's story, but it's all kind of told on the backdrop of Palestinian and Kuwaiti history, because her family is from Palestine, but they were ethnically cleansed and then resettled in Kuwait as refugees. And in fact, in many ways, our main character identifies more with the country that she's currently living in than with Palestine. That is until Yasser Arafat and his kind of fall from grace supporting the Iraqis, which essentially led a lot of Kuwaitis to turn on the Palestinian people who have been living in their country for so long. And so our main character, her mother and her brother decide to flee. That's where I'm up to right now. It's intense. But I am hoping to get at least most of it done today, because I'm going back to work tomorrow and I won't have as much time to read tomorrow and the next couple of days. So that's the goal for today. I also have a book club chat with my patrons quite soon, I think in like 10 or 15 minutes. So I've just made myself a cup of tea. The protest yesterday was great as always, and I'm just so glad I got there this week, and also just really, really happy that Blair came with me. He's come with me to 3 of them now, so almost half as many as I've been to. The energy though yesterday was incredible. It always is. It's such a grassroots, like family oriented affair. Gary Foley was one of the several speakers again this week, and I know I've mentioned him several times over the years. It sounds a bit cliche to say, but if I had to pick someone to describe as my hero, he would be it. He taught me so much when I was lucky enough to be in his class for 6 months several years ago. And I've heard him speak at many a protest over the years. Usually it's Invasion Day rallies and Black Lives Matter rallies, but he's always made it very clear that international solidarity between Indigenous peoples and colonized peoples is very important to him. And so to hear his voice week after week is just really inspiring to me. But anyway, I've been ranting for longer than I meant to. It's 2 minutes until my live chat starts with my Patreon, so I'm gonna head off, and hopefully I'll be able to talk to you later and let you know that I finished this book. Hello friends, we are right back where we started, and I have finished Against the Loveless World tonight. I really, really enjoyed reading this book. I read it so quickly. I mean, the audiobook helped, but I just didn't want to put it down. Our main character, Nar, we follow her from when she was about 17, 18, I think, right up until quite far into her life. And as I said, everything that we learn from her, she's telling us from her prison cell. And essentially, after the setup that I spoke to you about earlier, Nar does go back to Palestine after the signing of the Oslo Accords, making it possible for her to return for the first time. And basically, without giving too much away, once there, she gets involved in the resistance. There are some really incredible and beautiful moments in this book that just detail different aspects of Palestinian culture
whether it's from her mother's embroidery and needlework that is steeped in their heritage, or the harvesting of olives. Equally though, we see how Western intervention in the Middle East just has caused so much damage to communities and to culture and to general stability in the area. And then obviously once we're in Palestine, we get a pretty clear indication of the apartheid and the occupation and the everyday violences of Israel. And the author is unapologetic in her framing of Israel as a colonial occupation and in her framing of violent resistance by Palestinians. It's situated firmly in a conversation about colonialism and occupation, and it's about those voices who are experiencing that. Quite a lot of the book is also about sexism and misogyny and the particular kinds of violences that women are faced with. It is a pretty straightforward narrative, although we have our main character Na in isolation in prison, and she is telling us her story from prison. The story that she is telling us about her life is very linear. It's very clear, and it's all from her perspective. So it's very, very easy to read and accessible in terms of structure and narrative, even if the content itself is very heavy. And I suppose at the end of the day, the story just does such an incredible job of humanizing the experience of exile, the detachment from home, from land, from culture, what it means to try and reclaim that, even in the face of such hostility and violence. And I guess the lengths people are willing to go for freedom and for what they love, both the people they love, the culture they love, and the land that they love. At the end of the book, the acknowledgements do talk about the fact that Susan interviewed a bunch of people with different experiences, whether that was imprisonment or exile, and she used those experiences to inform this fictionalized story. And it sounds like she took a few different women's experiences and kind of put them all together to create Na's journey, which I do feel like you can see in Na. She has very kind of particular sections of her story or moments in her story. I feel like I'm doing a pretty bad job of explaining to you how I feel about this book. I suppose I just felt so many feelings so strongly the entire way through. I felt anger, I felt disgust, I felt hope, I felt love, I felt such deep sadness and anguish. I felt it all. I felt it all. And I suppose I just feel like that in and of itself is an incredible achievement. And as I said, a lot of this book is based on actual historical events and actual people. And so obviously it makes sense that so much of this would ring true, but equally the fact that this was published 3 or 4 years ago, which I know isn't that long, but it's so relevant. But there was literally one part in here about how Israel is very quick to label anybody who challenges them as the next Hitler or a Nazi, which we're literally seeing constantly at the moment. And the descriptions of the just incredible level of disproportionate violence. I mean, you know what I'm talking about. I think this story would have hit me hard had I read it almost any time, but reading it right now, it just kind of took it to another level. But with that done, we have finished the 4 books that we set out to read this week, which is good timing because tomorrow is Tuesday, so I'm back at work and I won't be reading tomorrow. Even though it is the last day of the reading week, I'm not going to be able to start a book and finish it by tomorrow, so I think we should just wrap it up there. And this was just such a powerful and wonderful experience. I really hope that came across in the video. In a lot of ways, this video kind of became a little bit of a labor of love for me, somewhere to put all of my anger and love and heartache and grief. I really enjoyed the experience of reading all of these, and that enjoyment was only heightened by getting to share this with you. So thank you so much for being here. Before I sign off, I just wanted to share a very small little something with you. A couple of weeks ago at one of the Palestinian rallies in Naam, there was an Aboriginal poet who I cannot remember the name of. It was hard enough to hear them at all over the speakers, and I haven't been able to figure out their name since. So if you know, please let me know in the comments below. But this Aboriginal poet basically had written a poem for Palestine, and they read it out at one of the rallies. And I remember the verses being beautiful and crying several times, but essentially there was a chorus, I guess, where they would read out one line and the crowd, we would respond with the same line. We would echo it. And we repeated this chorus, these 4 lines, back to the poet several times. And it just felt, to be honest, it became like a prayer. And I just remember being in that crowd. It was at one of the bigger rallies, possibly 100,000 of us repeating these words together. And I just kept thinking that I hope that something of these words, these feelings that we're all feeling right now, make their way to Palestine, to Gaza. And I found myself repeating them, you know, whether out loud when I'm at home by myself or even just in my head in those moments where I'm really struggling to continue to bear witness to what we're witnessing, struggling to keep showing up, to keep contacting my representatives when I'm scared of making phone calls. They've become a mantra to me as well, to just keep going and to keep doing what we need to do to stand for what's right, to stand with humanity. So I wanted to share those words with you because they've helped me a lot. So I hope they help you too. And feel free to repeat them after me, just as we did at the protest. Palestine, we love you. Palestine, we care. We're fighting for your freedom. We rise from our despair. Palestine, we love you. Palestine, we care. We're fighting for your freedom. We rise from our despair. Palestine, we love you. Palestine, we care. We're fighting for your freedom. We rise from our despair. So again, if you know who that poet was, if you know their name, please let me know in the comments below. I've been trying to figure it out for the last few weeks and it just has eluded me, and I keep returning to those words and I would love to know who to credit. But anyway, thank you again so much for joining me. Links to anything relevant or anything that I spoke about will be in the description box below for you. I don't really know how to end this, so I'm just going to wrap up like I usually do. A big heartfelt thank you to my wonderful patrons over on Patreon, and especially big thank you to Olivia, Lynette Brown and Marie. I'll talk to you all again soon, and in the meantime, so much love and free Palestine.